Language deprivation can happen with people who can hear, but it just doesn't happen that often or as easily. Maybe you've heard the name GRE. If you look on Wikipedia, and you search language deprivation, it'll pull up 5 names. Anna, Casper, GRE, Victor, and one more name. They all are known cases of language deprivation in people who can hear within the last 250 years in recent history. That means language deprivation has happened, but only about twice in a century for those who can hear. 5 kids. I myself work with kids who have language deprivation or are deaf. I work with 5 kids every day. Wikipedia doesn't take into account deaf kids. Hopefully that'll change tomorrow, but it'll take time. Let's see, next page. So what is an important, should I say, critical time period for learning language? Back in the day, maybe 20 years ago, it was pretty controversial, but now that argument has been settled, and it's been shown through recent research that that window declines rapidly as time goes by, and your cognitive ability decreases to learn language. One amazing person, scientist specifically, who has done amazing work over the last 30 years on cognitive sciences, used an fMRI, which just means neural scanning, neural imaging, and you can see which parts of the brain are activated. Rachel Mayberry, the scientist, saw that sign language. Well, let me preface this by saying people used to think that sign language was activated in the occipital lobe, the back of the brain, because it's visual. You see something and then the back of the brain is activated, right? Nobody anticipated that sign language would be activated in the side of the brain where language is activated. Well, those misconceptions were wrong. When people did studies, and they studied people who were Native American Sign Language users, they found that ASL activated the same areas of the brain as spoken language. This is because of the speed of the processing. Native language users don't have to think about reading a word. You just read the word. Because the processing is so fast, it happens in the front, towards the front of the brain, rather than in the back. You know about the word. You know how the word sounds like. You know what the word sounds like, what it looks like. You know the semantic meaning. Even though signing is more visual and tactile, you don't confuse the signs just like you don't confuse the words. It's the same area. It's just instant, just like reading. But tactile processes, like feeling something, visual processes, those are slower processes. Me personally, I'm not a native sign language user, so my processing is a little slower. The area in which my brain is activated when I use sign language is probably a little bit different, slightly to a side, per se. It's almost fully fluent. If I didn't have an initial language, an L1, That would be impossible for me. Rachel, as a scientist, was a very neutral person. She didn't get involved with the politics. For her research, she knew she better have good documentation. So she finished her study. And she found that those without an L1 practically had destroyed brains when it came to language learning. People who didn't have an L1, specifically deaf people, showed delayed cognitive development and later in life had problems as well. Okay, next slide. Just like with language, it's important to have proper ASL so that your mental processes can continue to grow. I'll let you guys read the slide real quick. Okay. Surprising, right? Shocking. Very cool. Okay, so the back of the brain, aka the occipital lobe, that's the name of the part of the brain. Natural language users have an enlarged occipital lobe. Fluent speakers also have an additional area in the brain compared to later developed language users. Strange. Well, what that means is that kids who grow up with parents that teach them language, whether it be visual involvement or spoken language involvement, doesn't matter which two, spoken language still influences the occipital lobe as well. Just like with sign language, the occipital lobe grows with language skill development as well. Sorry about reading all the slides. What about when hearing parents want their deaf child to join hearing culture? Learning sign language would elevate their language level. Parents are concerned that their kid will miss out on their culture, but they don't understand that comes at a cost. If you don't have the highest level of language, you don't have the second highest, and the third highest, fourth highest, until you're down to a minimal language person. Make sense? Language affects many things. People don't even think about it. Well, because you learned language long ago, you don't remember how beneficial it really is, or how much it affects. Most people, how do I phrase this? Okay, well, language affects many things. People don't think about that because most people learned language long ago when they were very young. They forget how it really feels. It's natural now, and it feels like nothing. Just like nothing. All right, next slide. I am not a linguist. I'm just a cognitive scientist. I learn about language deprivation because of my patients, who I see every day. I noticed something common. I'm a deaf and hard of hearing service provider, so I see their literacy. I see what they see. I can connect. Just learning 3 words helps so much and can be so empowering. 3 words. Somebody without that can't express anything, even on a basic level, and we can't understand each other. That's not developing language. That's not developing the occipital lobe. Deprivation happens. What can we expect from a person who's showing behavior of language deprivation? We have to have formal measurements. Next slide, please. There were 98 cases. This is where we measured based on age, language exposure, and if they were a danger to themselves or to the community. Next slide. This graph shows the findings. And there's a big difference. About 10% did very poorly on the tests and showed high signs of language deprivation. This is a graph of those who spoke fluently and didn't. Green shows normal. Red is bad. Yellow is all right. You can see that many of our clients don't have early regular L1 development. Next slide. This is clear. This is obvious. So now we'll use the statistics and the research to make correlations. And you can see the correlation is strong. Okay, next slide. These findings are sad. Not surprising, but sad. We see with adults that they have many things wrong with them. They get frustrated. They don't understand their feelings. And that leads to even more frustration. And a lot of cognitive disabilities as well. For most deaf people here, that might be something that we are all familiar with. It's fascinating, really, the different perspectives of the deaf community and how they know so well about language deprivation. See, a classroom interpreter in school, per se, may have given language access, but it's not full L1 exposure. There's many different perspectives. Next slide. There's a lot of data. How to measure it all, how it all fits together with cochlear implants and hearing aids, it takes an expert. And I'm sure that the deaf community is an expert in all that as well. I'll comment just a little bit. If you're deaf and you see kids with a language delay, it's obvious. Hearing parents with deaf kids might implant their kid and speak to them spoken language. And that's normal. It's providing equal access to them because they're speaking the word. But the problem is the spoken language is not equivalent to their L1. From a different perspective about deaf children, we can solve that issue. If you shift the perspective that a deaf child can learn sign language and have an appropriate L1 development, then that kid will ramble on and on and on, as opposed to a kid who is spoken to and just is hyper and not communicating. I've chosen a variety of results to show about cochlear implants and hearing aids. And there's none of them that are 100% conclusive, which opens the debate. I want to show people with cochlear implants these publications. They feature different words with hyperactive deaf kids. 70% of them that are hyperactive don't understand language yet. Do you think that 70% is literate? They're not. They won't. Anyway, there are many topics to touch on. I'll let people comment and share their different experiences later. Next slide. Deaf people really envision language. Deaf people measure things from the top. There's top-down processing and bottom-up processing. Cochlear implant results vary greatly. Some have very successful quote-unquote language skills, and some don't. But this is off topic. Remember one very specific example. The results were shown on a graph that showed 56 kids with cochlear implants, and their language skills went up in a linear result. And I thought, wow, I need to change my strategy. Maybe cochlear implants are successful. But then I looked at it a little closer, and I saw that the results were numbered in a way that the 56 kids going along the line graph, it wasn't exactly what was the eye was seeing. There was missing data. I know some kids in my practice, in my institution, therapy, educational system, and later in life when they go to group homes, they will have cochlear implants. And they'll be left, but it's not really language fluency. It's a terrible experience to have language deprivation. And if a surgeon, and if the outcome is different, I would like to see that difference. Once the surgery is done for a cochlear implant, the outcome might not be that they're fluent in language. They're still deaf. And I don't care if they can walk the walk per se. They have to talk the talk. I've been doing readings, doing interviews, gathering data, and working with different departments regarding linguistics. And I want to open up the discussion to you lovely people. I want to hear what you have to say and what you recognize about language deprivation. All right, next slide. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about emotional responses to disabilities. If someone with a disability, who you might know, or maybe don't know, has an emotional reaction, say they're in a wheelchair, you might feel a little helpless. And I believe that's a normal feeling, to have a little bit of shock. Why? Because, well, we feel pity, maybe at first. It's a neural response. I have a vision for myself that if that happens to me, my life would be changed for the worse. So to see someone like that is very difficult. And for the first moment when you do see that, it's slightly traumatic. And that's normal. But there's a problem. The person in that wheelchair maybe hasn't felt trauma. Maybe they have. Maybe something happened yesterday where they were in a car accident and now they're in a wheelchair. Or maybe that's just how their way of life is. And the person is still content with their life. Maybe they're fed up with people giving them sympathy or pointing out their condition. It's a misconception. Maybe that person doesn't want you to see them as just a person in a wheelchair. But we haven't thought about that before. The normal response is a little awkward. That's fine. But it's important to separate those and think if it was a recent accident as something horrible or maybe something else. If I label somebody as quote unquote not normal, that means I draw an imaginary circle around myself. I'm in the normal and everyone else is in the abnormal space outside of my circle. It's not a great way to think about it. But if we have a definition of normal, then what is that definition? There have been international studies, and there has been results to go with those studies about what people view as normal. When people measure what normal is, we get a bell curve. It's called the normal curve, per se. Before those findings, there were Western traditions about people and their language. That was the ideal. But who was really ideal? It's an impossible standard. Some people were viewed as quote-unquote perfect, but the vast majority was outside of that bubble that we draw around ourselves as being normal. Most hearing people think as themselves as being normal. But we can't prove that. I have a different idea of normal. For example, I think hearing is a spectrum. Development is a spectrum. Height is a spectrum. And we're all normal. Some people can hear. Some people have hearing loss. And that's normal. Whatever you want can be normal. It's become an issue. Some people don't even know about it. But believe it or not, it is a discussion that needs to be had. So please, if you have questions now, form a line at the end of the desk. Come on up, don't be shy. I want to hear your ideas. Come on, we need more of you in the line. All of you are so shy. Come on up. Ask some questions. My question for you, Mr. Gulade. For hearing parents who need to make a decision on what to do with their deaf child, what is your best recommendation for how they should approach the issue? I want to understand who they are. I want to understand their fears, their concerns, their interests. I want to know what problems they might have. There's 358 or 59 towns affected with one thing. Providing sign language or implanting their kid in a small community. I want to open up the discussion. I want to talk about their fears, their concerns if they think that their child will grow up in a normal way, or if they think that being deaf is awful. I can work with that. Often what happens is that parents meet me, a deaf individual, and they relax. Thank you. Sorry to ramble on the discussion. It's not a short one. It's one that needs to be talked about in depth. I would talk to any parents, no matter the age of their kid. Sometimes parents of 40 or parents of 60 will come to my office. It doesn't matter the level of success, their expectations, or maybe something not meeting their expectations. We're all the same. Thank you. Hi, I'm a student here. My question is, for your medical practices, well, really, this is actually two questions. My first question is, during your medical practices, when you were becoming a doctor, right, what would you recommend for somebody who also is going through that same thing? That's really important. There's a lot of doctors out there, a lot of hearing doctors too, a lot of parents who have deaf children. They don't know what to do. So they ask the doctor, and the doctor might not know. So what do you think would be some important information for doctors, especially in modern times, that might not have that information, to give to hearing parents who would just have a deaf baby? I think the shock that comes when you have a deaf baby for hearing parents and hearing people in general comes with school and the hours that it will take learning with this quote-unquote sickness. Maybe 100 hours, 1,000 hours of just repetition, and what that has to do with it. But people need to realize that being deaf, well, let's look at it from another perspective. Being deaf is not an issue you need to solve. You don't need to improve hearing. My family, science, and I understand their perspective. You really need to just try to change people's approach and perspective. Sorry, I'm going on. You try to make people use different modes of language. We have different cognitive experiments that show what happens when people get sick. In France, there was a study carried where babies who are born have an easier time learning, and then other babies just can't. They're just born a certain way. So what can you do, like those French people who are born with a sickness that prohibits their learning?